Welcome to Mr. Phantom, where fear hides in every shadow and chilling tales come to life. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like this video to get a scary story every night. Tonight, I bring you a story that may make you think twice before answering a sound that shouldn't be there. Imagine this. You're lying in bed, the quiet of the night wrapping around your home. Then, faintly, you hear it, the soft cries of a baby, but the sound is coming from the abandoned house at the end of the street. What would you do? Would you ignore it? Or would curiosity drive you to step closer to a place that should have been left alone? This is the story of someone who chose to find out and uncovered something that should have stayed buried in the dark. Get ready to hold your breath, because this is the terrifying tale of the crying baby in the empty house. I never believed in ghosts, at least not until I moved to that small town in Texas. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find anything extraordinary, just a quiet, sleepy town where people kept to themselves. That's exactly what I needed after my divorce. I was tired of the noise, the constant reminders of my past life in the city. So when I found a small rental house on the edge of town for cheap, I didn't think twice. I packed my things and drove straight there, convinced this was my chance at a fresh start. The house itself wasn't anything special. A single-story building with faded white paint and a crooked mailbox. The lawn was overgrown, and the wooden fence around it leaned dangerously to one side. It looked tired, like a place that had given up trying to look presentable. But it was affordable, and more importantly, it was quiet. At least that's what I thought. My first week in the house was uneventful. I spent my days unpacking, getting familiar with the town, and chatting with the occasional neighbor. Most people seemed friendly enough, though a little distant. They didn't seem to care much for small talk, which suited me fine. I wasn't looking to make friends. I just wanted peace. There was one neighbor, though, who stood out. The man who lived next door. His name was Mr. Donovan, an older guy in his late 60s with silver hair and a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. He rarely spoke to anyone and never seemed to leave his house except to water his lawn. I'd often see him standing on his porch, hands on his hips, staring across the street at the old, empty house directly opposite ours. That house was different. It looked wrong. The windows were grimy and dark, the paint peeled off in patches, and the roof sagged like it was tired of holding itself up. Something about it gave me the creeps. Every time I walked past it, I'd quicken my steps without even realizing it. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, I noticed Mr. Donovan on his porch again, staring at that same house. Curiosity got the better of me. "You all right?" I called out half-jokingly. "Forget your TV remote in there or something?" He didn't laugh. Instead, he gave me a look, the kind that made my skin crawl. His eyes were sharp and cold, like he was sizing me up. "You're new," he muttered. "Yeah," I said, unsure how to respond. "Just moved in last week." He nodded slowly, still watching me. "Stay away from that house," he said. "Don't go near it." I chuckled awkwardly, trying to lighten the mood. "Why? Place haunted or something?" Mr. Donovan didn't smile. His face stayed hard, his eyes fixed on mine. "Just leave it alone," he said firmly. Then he turned and went back inside without another word. I stood there for a moment, feeling unsettled. Maybe the guy was just old and paranoid. Small towns were full of rumors and urban legends. Maybe this was one of those cases. I decided to forget about it. But as the days passed, I couldn't help but notice things. Small, strange things. For one, no one ever seemed to walk past that empty house. The sidewalk in front of it was cracked and overgrown with weeds, like it hadn't been touched in years. Kids rode their bikes up and down the street, but they always steered clear of that spot. Even the mailman seemed to skip it entirely. And then there was Mr. Donovan. Every evening, like clockwork, he'd come out onto his porch and just watch the house. No phone, no book, no drink. He'd just stand there, arms crossed, his eyes never leaving the dark windows across the street. I told myself it was nothing, just an old man with too much time on his hands. But deep down, something about it gnawed at me. One night, about a week after I'd moved in, I was sitting in my living room watching TV when I noticed movement through the window. Mr. Donovan was out on his porch again, but this time he wasn't alone. A man in a dark coat was standing at the edge of the empty house's yard, staring right back at Mr. Donovan. They didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there locked in some strange silent standoff. After a few minutes, the man turned and disappeared down the street. The whole thing left me feeling uneasy. I told myself it wasn't my problem, whatever weird town drama this was. I didn't want any part of it. I locked my doors, drew the curtains, and tried to forget about it. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it for the first time. A sound that would haunt me for weeks to come. It started faintly, a soft, distant cry. I sat up in bed, listening. The sound grew louder, a high-pitched wail that carried through the walls. It sounded like a baby crying, sharp, desperate sobs that seemed to come from somewhere outside. I got out of bed and went to the window. The street was dark and empty, no sign of anyone outside. Yet the crying continued, louder now, almost frantic. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but as I strained to listen, a terrible realization hit me. The sound wasn't coming from the street. It was coming from inside the empty house across the road. I stood frozen at the window, heart pounding. The crying didn't stop. It just kept going, this endless, tortured wail that seemed to echo inside my skull. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was a cat or some weird plumbing noise. Anything to explain what I was hearing. But deep down, I knew better. That sound was too real, too human. I turned away from the window, determined to go back to bed and ignore it. Whatever it was, it wasn't my problem. But just as I lay down, I glanced once more toward Mr. Donovan's house. He was still on his porch, still staring at the empty house. Only this time, he wasn't alone. A shadow moved behind one of the upstairs windows in the empty house. Just for a second, but enough for me to see it. A figure, standing motionless in the dark, staring back at Mr. Donovan. I pulled the blankets over my head and tried to sleep, but the crying didn't stop. Not for hours. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. The sound of that crying, that awful, pitiful wailing, had kept me awake for hours. Even when it finally stopped, the silence felt just as heavy. Every creak of the house made me flinch. Every passing car sounded like footsteps outside my window. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I dragged myself out of bed, brewed some coffee, and tried to shake the unease. The bright morning sunlight streaming through the windows should have been comforting, but it only felt wrong, like the light didn't belong there. The air in my house seemed colder than usual, and no matter how many times I rubbed my arms, the chill wouldn't go away. I kept telling myself it was just in my head. After all, this town had clearly gotten to me. Small towns always had their share of creepy rumors, and Mr. Donovan's bizarre behavior had probably planted the idea in my mind. That had to be it. But as I stepped outside to grab the morning paper, I froze. Mr. Donovan was still on his porch, still staring at the empty house. He hadn't moved. His arms were still crossed, his gaze locked on that same upstairs window where I'd seen the shadow the night before. His eyes looked sunken, dark circles etched beneath them like he hadn't slept in days. For a second, I considered walking over to check on him, but something about his expression stopped me. He wasn't just tired, he looked afraid. I swallowed hard and tried to act normal, grabbing the paper from my yard. As I turned to head back inside, Mr. Donovan's voice stopped me cold. "You heard it, didn't you?" I paused mid-step. "Heard what?" He turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing. "Don't play dumb. You heard the baby." I forced a weak chuckle. "I think you've got the wrong guy. You're not the first one to hear it," he muttered, barely above a whisper. "And you won't be the last. Look, I don't know what You need to leave," he interrupted, his voice sharpening. "That house, it's not right." I stared at him, unsure how to respond. The intensity in his voice unsettled me, but part of me, the stubborn, rational part, refused to believe whatever weird local legend he was pushing. "I'm sure there's a perfectly normal explanation," I said, trying to sound calm. "Maybe an animal got stuck in there, or—" "It's not an animal," Mr. Donovan snapped, his face twisted with frustration. "You think I haven't been through this before? You think I haven't tried to explain it away?" He let out a bitter laugh. "I've seen good people lose their minds over that house. Heard men cry like children after spending a single night inside." He leaned closer, voice low and cold. "You keep pretending it's nothing. You won't last long." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was crazy, but something about his expression made my words die in my throat. His fear wasn't fake. Whatever he believed it with every fiber of his being. "I'll be fine," I said, turning away. "Have a good day, Mr. Donovan." I went inside, locked my door, and tried to push the whole conversation out of my mind. I had work to do, and I wasn't about to let a paranoid old man spook me. But the tension didn't leave. All day, I found myself glancing out the window at that empty house. The upstairs window where I'd seen the shadow stayed dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me from inside. By the time evening came, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The town was quiet, the streets mostly empty except for a few passing cars. I deliberately avoided walking past the empty house, no sense feeding my imagination. Instead, I looped around the block, breathing in the cool night air, trying to reset my nerves. It worked for a while. By the time I got home, I felt calmer. The tension in my chest had eased, and I actually laughed at myself for letting things get to me. Mr. Donovan's stories, the shadow in the window, it was just my brain playing tricks on me. Nothing more. I locked my doors, turned on some music, and spent the rest of the evening convincing myself everything was fine. But at exactly 2:07 a.m., the crying started again. I shot upright in bed, my heart hammering. It was louder this time, high-pitched and frantic, like the baby was in pain. I stumbled to the window, gripping the curtain tightly before daring to peek outside. The street was empty, no one in sight, but the sound was clearer now, and I could tell exactly where it was coming from. The empty house. I stood frozen, trying to convince myself to ignore it. Maybe if I just stayed in bed, it would stop on its own. But the crying only got louder and louder. I paced my living room, debating whether I should call the cops. But what would I even say? That I heard a baby crying in a house that's been abandoned for years? They'd laugh me off the phone. The sound kept building, sharp, desperate wails that made my skin crawl. My mind raced with awful thoughts. What if someone really was in there? What if some poor kid had gotten trapped inside? What if that shadow I saw wasn't my imagination? Finally, I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the door. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I told myself I'd just get close enough to listen, enough to be sure it was all in my head. Then I'd go home and forget about it. The cold night air hit me like a slap when I stepped outside. The street was silent except for that awful crying. I forced myself forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I reached the sidewalk in front of the house, I hesitated. The crying was deafening now, like it was just beyond the door. I shined my flashlight toward the upstairs window and froze. The shadow was back. It wasn't moving, just standing there, still and silent. But I knew it was watching me. Even in the dark, I could feel its eyes. My breath hitched, and for a second, I considered turning back. But then I heard something new. A faint, choked sound beneath the crying, like someone whispering. A voice. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like pleading. A desperate, breathless whisper. And that's when I realized the crying wasn't just coming from inside the house. It was coming from upstairs, from the room where I'd seen the shadow. I stood there, heart racing, frozen in place. The whispers grew louder, blending with the baby's wails. My legs screamed for me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. Then the upstairs window shifted just slightly. The shadow, it leaned forward, and I swear to God, it smiled. I stumbled backward from the sidewalk, nearly dropping my flashlight. My breath came in ragged bursts, and my chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped a cold hand around my ribs and was squeezing. The shadow in the window stayed there, unmoving, except for that awful, twisted smile. I spun on my heel and hurried back toward my house. My hands shook so badly that I fumbled with my keys twice before I finally got the door unlocked. I slammed it behind me, bolted the lock, and stood there in the dark, gasping for breath. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The crying, the shadow. Maybe I was sleep-deprived, still shaken from the divorce, and letting paranoia get the better of me. But deep down, I knew better. That smile wasn't something my imagination could invent. The crying had stopped now. The silence was somehow worse. The kind that hums in your ears and makes you painfully aware of your own breathing. I barely slept that night. Every sound, a creak in the floor, a gust of wind against the window, had me clutching my blanket like a lifeline. When morning finally came, I felt like I'd been through a war. I needed answers. After a strong cup of coffee and a lot of pacing, I decided to talk to Mr. Donovan. Whatever was happening in that house, he knew something, and I needed to know what. I found him outside, watering his plants like nothing had happened. He didn't seem surprised to see me. "You look like hell," he muttered, barely sparing me a glance. That house," I stammered. "I saw something in the window, and I heard." I trailed off, feeling stupid. How was I supposed to explain what I'd seen without sounding insane? "You heard the baby," Mr. Donovan finished grimly. "And you saw the shadow." I stared at him. "You knew." He set down his watering can and sighed heavily. I told you to stay away. Yeah, well, I didn't. My voice shook a little, and I hated how weak I sounded. What the hell is going on in there? Mr. Donovan studied me for a moment, like he was deciding how much to tell me. Finally, he motioned for me to follow him inside. His house was dim and cluttered, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and stale coffee. The curtains were drawn, and stacks of yellowed newspapers sat piled in the corners. "Sit," he said, pointing to a worn-out recliner. I obeyed, still trying to slow my racing heart. "You're not the first," he said finally. "That house, it's been bad for a long time." He reached for a dusty photo frame on the coffee table and handed it to me. The photo showed a young woman holding a baby in her arms. Both were smiling, but the woman's eyes looked tired, sad. "Her name was Emily," Mr. Donovan said quietly. "Lived there with her son about 15 years ago." I studied the picture. "What happened?" Mr. Donovan's jaw tightened. "No one's sure," he said. "Emily was troubled. Some folks said she had depression. Others thought she was just lonely. But one night something snapped. She stopped answering her phone, stopped going outside. People thought she'd just packed up and left. Then someone heard crying coming from the house, just like you did last night." I swallowed hard. "They found her a week later," Mr. Donovan continued, "dead in her bedroom. No sign of a struggle, no wounds, just gone." "And the baby?" I asked, already dreading the answer. His face darkened. "They found him too, in his crib. He'd been dead for days. Starved." I felt my stomach turn. "Jesus." "After that," Mr. Donovan said, "the crying never stopped. People kept hearing it. Sometimes weeks would go by with nothing, and then one night it'd start up again. Anyone who went inside that house came out different, if they came out at all." I gripped the arm of the chair tightly. "So you're saying that, what? A ghost is haunting that house?" "I don't know what's in there," Mr. Donovan said, "but I know it's bad." I sat in silence for a long time, my mind racing. Maybe the house needs to be cleaned out," I suggested. "Maybe there's something left behind that's causing this." Mr. Donovan's expression darkened. "You think no one's tried that? People have brought in priests, psychics, you name it. None of it's worked." He paused, lowering his voice. "There's something evil in that place, and whatever it is, it wants out." I left Mr. Donovan's house feeling even worse than before. Part of me still wanted to believe there was a rational explanation, a gas leak, or some weird acoustics that made it sound like crying. But deep down, I knew the truth. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, too wired to sleep. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. I kept glancing at my window, half expecting to see that twisted smile staring back at me. And then, at 2:07 a.m., the crying started again. It was louder this time, more urgent. The sound clawed at my ears, sending ice down my spine. I buried my face in my pillow, but it didn't help. The wailing seemed to cut right through the walls, vibrating in my skull. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and stormed outside, too angry and exhausted to be scared. The empty house loomed in the dark, its windows like hollow eyes. The crying came from somewhere upstairs, muffled but unmistakable. The front door was slightly ajar. I stood on the porch, heart hammering. Every instinct told me to turn back, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But the crying, it didn't sound like a ghost anymore. It sounded real, like a baby in pain. Couldn't ignore it. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick and sour, reeking of rot and mildew. My flashlight flickered as I moved through the living room. Furniture sat draped in dusty sheets, and cobwebs clung to the corners like gray veils. The crying grew louder, drawing me toward the stairs. The wooden steps groaned beneath my feet as I climbed. I reached the landing, and the sound was deafening now. A shrill, agonized wail that seemed to come from the room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly open. I reached for the doorknob and froze. From the crack in the door, I saw something, a crib. And in that crib, something moved. My breath caught as I pushed the door open. The crib rocked gently back and forth, the crying still echoing from within. My flashlight's beam trembled in my hand as I stepped closer. And then I saw it, a bundle of filthy, rotting blankets in the crib. The stench hit me hard, the unmistakable scent of death. But worse than that, I saw the face, a shriveled, blackened face. The skin stretched tight over tiny bones. The lips cracked and curled, but somehow, the sound of crying still poured from that twisted mouth. The dead baby's eyes snapped open, and they locked onto mine. I staggered back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The crying turned into a piercing, ear-splitting shriek that seemed to fill the entire room. Then the blankets shifted, and something beneath them started to crawl. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat as the decayed bundle beneath the blankets twitched again. The air inside the room felt suffocating, heavy and damp, like I was breathing through a soaked rag. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam flickering weakly as if the light itself was afraid to stay. The shriveled face in the crib stared at me with those lifeless, blackened eyes. The twisted thing's mouth still moved, that awful, wailing cry rising in pitch until it became a sharp, agonized screech. The sound burrowed into my skull, vibrating in my bones. And then the blankets shifted again. A withered skeletal hand, tiny and claw-like, slid out from beneath the stained fabric. The fingers twitched, curling like insect legs. Then it started to move. The thing crawled. I stumbled back, barely managing to stifle a scream. The thing dragged itself over the crib's railing, its brittle limbs creaking with each jerking motion. The skin on its arms was gray and peeling, clinging tightly to the bone like dried leather. Each twisted movement seemed impossible, unnatural, yet it kept pulling itself closer, one brittle hand slapping against the floorboards, then the other. I bolted. Spinning on my heel, I staggered out into the hallway. My shoulder slammed into the wall, but I didn't stop. The thing's shrill screech followed me down the stairs, echoing off the walls like nails on glass. My flashlight danced wildly in my grip, illuminating broken furniture and peeling wallpaper as I half ran, half stumbled toward the door. The front door was still open, hanging slightly ajar. I lunged forward, reaching for the handle. Bang! The door slammed shut in front of me. I froze, my chest heaving. I grabbed the knob and twisted hard, but it refused to budge. I yanked again, nothing. The lock wasn't turning, and the deadbolt had slid back on its own. Behind me, I heard the thing's bony limbs scraping across the wood floor. I spun around, and there it was, crawling down the stairs, its broken body twisting unnaturally with each jerky movement. Its hollow, black eyes locked on mine, and from its dry, shriveled throat came that distorted, agonized wail. I staggered back, fumbling with my phone in a desperate attempt to call 911. My fingers were shaking too badly to unlock the screen. The thing dragged itself closer, its twisted limbs reaching out for me. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I bolted deeper into the house, sprinting past dust-covered furniture and empty picture frames. I had no plan, no idea where I was going, but the thing was gaining on me. I heard its limbs scraping faster now, like bones rattling against the floor. I ducked into what looked like a kitchen, shoving a rusted chair behind me to slow it down. The room smelled rancid. Moldy food still clung to the countertops, long past rotting. I staggered toward the back door, praying it wasn't locked. I twisted the handle. It didn't budge. "Come on," I muttered, yanking at the knob with both hands. The screeching cry pierced the air again, louder this time, closer. I turned just in time to see it scuttling into the room. The thing's arms flailed wildly as it dragged itself forward. Its head twitched in sharp, unnatural jerks, and its blackened mouth twisted wider, like it was smiling. I grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the counter and swung it with everything I had. The heavy metal connected with a sickening crunch, and the thing jerked backward, crumpling against the floor. For a second, everything went still. I barely had time to breathe before the thing twitched again. Its body convulsed, limbs cracking and twisting back into place like broken branches snapping back into shape. Slowly, it turned its head toward me, that twisted grin still stretched across its face. My stomach turned. I bolted back through the house, sprinting blindly until I reached the staircase. My only thought was to get upstairs, to barricade myself somewhere, anywhere, and call for help. My phone was still clutched in my hand, but my fingers were numb. I couldn't even feel the screen. I stumbled into the first room I found and slammed the door behind me. My flashlight flickered weakly, its beam bouncing off the warped walls. I shoved a dresser in front of the door, my breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. The crying had stopped. The silence felt like a knife against my skin. For a second, I thought maybe I'd lost it, that whatever nightmare I'd seen had finally stopped. I fumbled with my phone, barely managing to unlock it, and that's when I heard it. A faint whisper. It wasn't the thing's screeching wail this time. It was softer. A woman's voice. I froze, straining to hear. "Help me," the voice whispered. It was coming from the corner of the room. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, and my blood turned to ice. A figure stood in the corner. A woman, pale and gaunt, her face twisted in anguish. Her hollow eyes locked on mine, and her mouth moved silently, forming words I couldn't understand. Her hand reached out, fingers trembling. "Please," she whispered again. "He won't stop." I staggered back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The air turned bitterly cold, and I felt something brush past me, like icy fingers dragging across my skin. The dresser behind me shifted. The door groaned as something heavy slammed against it from the other side. The whispering woman's face twisted in terror. "You have to stop him," she choked, her voice rising to a desperate wail. "Before he gets out." The door frame shuddered violently, the wood splintering beneath the force of whatever was on the other side. The thing's shrill scream tore through the room again, louder than before, filled with rage. "Gio!" the woman shrieked. I bolted. I threw the window open and hurled myself out onto the roof, hitting the shingles hard. My ribs screamed in pain, but I didn't stop. I scrambled down the side of the house, nearly slipping twice before my feet hit the frozen grass. The front door slammed open with a deafening bang. The thing was there, standing in the doorway now, not crawling anymore, but upright. Its body was still twisted and broken, its limbs hanging at odd angles, but it was standing. And it was smiling. I ran harder than I ever had in my life. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed with every step, but I didn't stop until I reached my own front door. I burst inside, locking the door behind me before collapsing on the floor. The crying had stopped. The street outside was empty, but I knew this wasn't over. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by my window, staring at that cursed house across the street. The thing hadn't followed me yet, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't finished with me. Not yet. I didn't leave my house the next day. I barely moved from the spot by my window, watching that cursed house across the street. My mind kept replaying the night before. The twisted face, the sickening crunch of brittle bones, and the way that thing had smiled at me before I ran. By morning, my thoughts had shifted from fear to dread. Whatever that thing was, I knew it wasn't finished. It hadn't followed me last night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was biding its time. By noon, I decided to call the police. I told them I'd heard disturbing sounds coming from the house. The crying, the screams, and that someone might be inside. I didn't mention the other details. Even as I tried to explain it, I realized how insane it would sound. An officer showed up an hour later, a stocky man with a tired face named Deputy Harris. He seemed skeptical from the start. "That house?" he asked, glancing toward the place with an almost dismissive shake of his head. "Look, pal, we get a lot of calls about that place. Kids messing around, homeless folks sneaking in. But there's never anything there." "This was different," I insisted. I saw something." He sighed, muttered something about damn old houses, then agreed to check it out. I stood on my porch as he crossed the street. He didn't hesitate, just marched right up to the door, knocked twice, and pushed it open. I watched him disappear inside. Minutes passed. The air felt heavy again, like the calm before a storm. My pulse hammered in my ears as I stared at that open door, half expecting something twisted and wrong to crawl out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Deputy Harris emerged. His expression was tight, his face pale. He glanced back at the doorway, muttered something under his breath, and started back toward me. You saw something, didn't you?" I asked the moment he reached my porch. He shook his head, but his eyes betrayed him. Something had rattled him. "House is empty," he said quickly. Too quickly. "Just some old junk, broken furniture. No one's been in there for a while." "But..." I hesitated. "You don't believe that." "I don't know what I believe," he sighed, running a hand down his face. "Look, don't go back in there. Whatever you think you saw, whatever you heard, just leave it alone." "You're telling me to ignore it?" I asked, incredulous. "I'm telling you to stay safe." His voice dropped to a warning whisper. "Some places, they just stay empty for a reason." He turned and walked back to his cruiser without another word. That night, I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face. The blackened skin stretched thin over bone, those cracked lips curling into a smile. I woke up in a cold sweat around 2 a.m., gasping for breath. The room was dark, but something felt wrong. The air was colder than it should have been, and the faint scent of rot lingered on the air. Then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Soft, deliberate taps like fingers rapping against glass. My blood turned to ice. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. A shadow stood outside. For a moment, I thought it might just be a tree branch or a trick of the light, but then the figure moved. Slowly, it shifted closer, and in the dim glow of the streetlights, I saw the face. The same twisted grin, the same hollow black eyes. It pressed one hand against the glass, a thin skeletal hand, and its fingers twitched, dragging down the window in slow, scraping motions. I wanted to scream, but my voice locked in my throat. My muscles refused to move. Tap, tap, tap. The thing's grin widened. It leaned closer, pressing its decayed face so tightly against the window pane that I could see the cracked texture of its skin, like dried paper stretched too thin. Then it whispered, "Let me in." I bolted upright, fumbling for my phone. My fingers shook as I punched in 911. 911, what's your emergency? A calm voice answered. There's someone outside my house. I gasped. It's not right. I think it followed me from that empty house. Sir, stay calm, the dispatcher said. An officer is on the way. Stay on the line. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the window. The thing's face was still there, grinning wider now, its teeth blackened and rotting. Its skeletal fingers scraped against the glass in slow, rhythmic patterns. Then, it began to fade. The skin peeled back, the grin stretched wider, and soon it was just a shadow, a distorted shape pressed against the glass. And then, nothing. By the time Deputy Harris arrived, I was still huddled in the corner of my bedroom, gripping a kitchen knife in one hand and my phone in the other. There was something here, I stammered. It was outside. It was watching me. He didn't question me this time. Instead, his face hardened. Pack a bag, he said quietly. You're coming with me. I didn't argue. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with clothes, and followed him out to his cruiser. We drove in silence for several minutes before he finally spoke. I've seen that thing before, he muttered. Twice. I swallowed hard. What is it? He shook his head. Don't know, but whatever it is, it's tied to that house. It doesn't leave on its own. You had to do something, touch something maybe, to make it follow you. I thought back to the room upstairs, the crib, the dead child's twisted face, that horrible, impossible scream. I think, my voice faltered, I think it's pretending to be that baby. Harris's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Then you're in real danger, he said. That thing, it doesn't stop. Once it picks someone, he didn't finish the sentence. We pulled into the parking lot of a small roadside motel. Harris checked me in under a different name, insisting it was safer if no one knew where I was staying. Stay here, he warned. Don't answer the door unless you hear my voice. Before he left, he hesitated in the doorway. You're not crazy, he muttered. Whatever this thing is, it's real. I spent the rest of the night in that room, wide awake and gripping the knife I'd brought with me. The window blinds were drawn tight, but I still imagined that twisted face pressed against the glass. The thing hadn't followed me here. Not yet, but I knew it would. And when it did, I wasn't sure if I'd survive. I didn't sleep. Not really. I spent the night curled up in the corner of the motel room, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. Every creak of the walls, every distant footstep outside the door made me flinch. I knew that thing was still out there, waiting. When morning finally crept in, I felt like a corpse myself, hollow-eyed and shaking, my mind clouded from exhaustion. I grabbed my phone and called Deputy Harris. No answer. I tried again. Straight to voicemail. I felt like the walls were closing in. The stale air of the motel room smelled faintly of mildew, and the thought of spending another night here made my stomach churn. I needed to do something. I paced the room, replaying everything in my head. The crying, the decaying body in the crib, the whispering woman, and that thing grinning at me through the window. Then it hit me. The woman's words, "Before he gets out." Who was he? I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I had to go back. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't finished with me yet. Hiding wouldn't help. I needed answers. I left the motel just before noon, driving back toward my neighborhood. The streets felt quieter than usual, like the whole world was holding its breath. As I approached the abandoned house, a knot of dread coiled in my stomach. The house looked different in daylight, less monstrous, but no less wrong. The windows were dark, like the glass had been smeared with soot. The air around it seemed still, like nothing dared move too close. I parked across the street and waited, watching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Whatever was inside, it wasn't showing itself yet. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of my car and crossed the street. The front door was still ajar from the night before, a jagged crack of darkness waiting for me. I hesitated on the porch, my fingers hovering over the door handle. Then I heard it, faint but unmistakable. The crying. That distorted wail echoed from somewhere inside the house, thin and broken, like a scratched recording playing on loop. My hand trembled as I pushed the door open. The air inside hit me like a wall, sour and rotten, thick with mildew and decay. I swallowed hard and stepped inside. The house seemed darker than before, the light barely penetrating past the doorway. The crying drifted down from upstairs, faint and distant. I followed it, each step creaking loudly beneath my feet. The air grew colder as I climbed, like I was stepping into a meat locker. At the top of the stairs, I turned toward the room with the crib. The door was open now, the faint sound of the crying coming from within. My heart hammered in my chest as I stepped inside. The crib was still there, and in it lay the same twisted, decaying bundle. But this time, it wasn't still. The bundle writhed beneath the blankets, the faint outline of tiny, spindly limbs twitching and twisting. The thin, dry wail gurgled out of its shriveled throat. I felt sick. "You have to stop him." The whispering woman's voice came from behind me, sharp and desperate. I spun around, and there she was, standing in the corner. She was more solid now, her gaunt face filled with fear. "He's waking up," she said, her voice quivering. "You have to stop him before he—" Her words cut off as the blanket in the crib shifted violently. A hand shot out, thin and skeletal, fingers curled like claws. The blanket slid back to reveal the thing's face, sunken and twisted, its lips curling into that awful smile. The twisted child thing lunged from the crib, landing on the floor with a sickening crunch. Its body twisted unnaturally, limbs bending in directions they shouldn't. It turned its black eyes toward me, mouth splitting open in a grin far too wide. "Let me in." I stumbled back, crashing into a dresser. The woman's voice rang out again, sharp and urgent. "The mirror. Break the mirror." I didn't understand, but I wasn't about to argue. I grabbed the rusted lamp from the dresser and spun toward the cracked mirror on the wall. The thing shrieked, a piercing, unnatural sound that made my ears ring. The twisted creature scuttled across the floor like a spider, limbs jerking wildly as it moved. It lunged at me, bony fingers stretching toward my face. I swung the lamp with everything I had. The mirror shattered, glass exploding across the room. A deafening roar erupted from the creature, and I felt something cold and sharp lash past me, like a gust of wind filled with ice. The thing screamed again, its body twisting and writhing as dark tendrils of shadow spilled from its open mouth. The woman's voice rose above the noise. "Don't stop. Destroy it." I grabbed a shard of broken glass and drove it down into the thing's chest. Its body convulsed violently, its twisted limbs flailing in every direction. The room seemed to darken, the air growing thicker as the shadowy tendrils stretched further. Then suddenly, everything stopped. The creature's body collapsed in on itself, its skin cracking and peeling away like dry leaves. Within seconds, there was nothing left but a shriveled husk, brittle and crumbling. The air in the room seemed to lift, the choking rot fading away. I stumbled back, gasping for breath. The whispering woman's form flickered, her face softening. "You did it," she whispered. "Thank you." Her voice faded, and a faint smile crossed her lips before her form vanished entirely. I stood there for a long time, staring at the crumbled remains on the floor. The house was quiet now. No crying, no whispers, just silence. I staggered down the stairs and out the front door, gulping down the fresh air like I'd been drowning. The sky was beginning to darken, but the air felt cleaner somehow. I didn't look back as I crossed the street and got into my car. Whatever that thing was, whatever nightmare had followed me, it was over, or at least, I hoped it was. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove. For hours, aimlessly. My mind kept circling back to that twisted creature's face, the way its bones had cracked and shifted as it lunged at me, the way its smile stretched far too wide. By the time I returned to my motel room, the sky was pitch black. I locked the door behind me, slid the chain across, and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. The room was stale, but I didn't care. I just needed to feel safe. I collapsed onto the bed, still wearing my shoes. Sleep came in fits, flashes of memories, distorted dreams where that thing's face leered at me from every shadow. I jolted awake sometime past midnight. The room was dark, but something felt off. My breath caught in my chest as my eyes adjusted. The faint glow of the motel's neon sign barely seeped through the blinds. Then I noticed it. The chain lock on the door was unhooked. The chair I'd wedged under the handle was toppled over. Someone had been inside. I grabbed the knife from the nightstand and crept through the room, flipping on lights and checking every corner. The bathroom was empty. The closet, too. There was no sign of anyone. But when I turned back to the bed, the sheets were wrinkled, as if someone had been lying there. A sickening chill washed over me, and I stumbled back against the wall. My fingers trembled against the knife's handle. Had I been dreaming, or had that thing found me again? I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, I knew what I had to do. Destroying the creature hadn't been enough. Something was still wrong. Something still felt unfinished. I needed answers. I drove to the county records office, figuring it was the best place to start. If that house was connected to whatever cursed thing I'd seen, there had to be some record of it. It took hours of digging, but I finally found something. A thin, yellowed file tucked away in the archives. The address of the house was printed in faded type across the top. The file was disturbing. The house had once belonged to a family named the Reynolds. A couple, Samuel and Lydia, and their newborn son, Thomas. The records didn't say much, But one newspaper clipping from the 1950s caught my eye. Tragic murder-suicide stuns neighborhood. The article claimed that Samuel Reynolds had killed his wife and child before hanging himself in the upstairs bedroom. Neighbors reported hearing the baby's cries for days afterward, though no one knew the family was dead until the bodies were discovered. But what really unsettled me was the footnote. The article claimed that when authorities found the infant's body, his mouth had been sewn shut. I slammed the file shut, my heart racing. That thing, the twisted creature I'd seen, it wasn't just some malevolent spirit. It was something born of that horrible act. The baby's soul, trapped in that decaying body, twisted and corrupted by whatever Samuel had done. I felt sick. I left the office and drove straight to Deputy Harris's station. He wasn't there. Another officer, a wiry man named Officer Darby, informed me that Harris had taken the morning off. Did he say where he was going? I asked. Darby shook his head. He didn't look too good, though. Seemed shaken, like something was eating him alive. I thanked him and left, but dread was gnawing at me. Harris had warned me to stay away from that house, but I'd ignored him. And now, I dialed his number again. No answer. I tried again, straight to voicemail. The pit in my stomach grew heavier. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down I knew where he'd gone. I sped back toward the neighborhood, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my fingers ached. As I turned onto my street, my breath caught in my chest. Harris's cruiser was parked directly in front of the abandoned house. The driver's side door was open. I barely remembered parking before I was sprinting across the street. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and empty. The air around it seemed thicker now, colder. I stepped inside. The stench of rot hit me immediately, stronger than before. The air was freezing, and the faint sound of something drifted from upstairs. Footsteps, slow and heavy. "Harris," I called out. My voice wavered. No reply. I forced myself up the stairs, each creak of the wood like a gunshot in the silence. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dim and distorted in the gloom. At the far end, the door to the nursery stood open. I reached the doorway and stopped cold. Harris stood in the middle of the room, facing away from me. His head was bowed, and his shoulders rose and fell in shallow breaths. "Harris," I said again, my voice barely louder than a whisper. He turned, and I staggered back. His face was pale, his eyes wide and hollow. Deep scratches lined his cheeks, as if he'd clawed at his own face. His lips were cracked and dry, and blood had crusted along his chin. "Too late," he croaked. His voice was barely human. "What?" I stammered. "What happened?" His gaze flicked toward the crib. I followed his eyes and froze. The crib was empty. The decaying child was gone. "He's out now," Harris whispered. His breath hitched. He found a way out. A noise, soft and wet, squelched from the hallway behind me. I spun around. The twisted child thing was there, but it was different now. Taller. Its limbs had stretched unnaturally long, and its face, oh God, its face. The once infantile features had distorted into something more human, yet still horribly wrong. Thin skin pulled tight over jagged bones. Its mouth stretched into a gaping grin. It opened its mouth wider, too wide, and let out that wretched, bubbling cry. Harris lunged at the creature with a shout, but the thing moved with impossible speed. It twisted its crooked limbs and leapt at him, driving bony fingers into his chest. "No!" I screamed. I grabbed a rusted fire poker from the corner and swung with all my strength. The metal rod struck the thing's skull with a sickening crack. It shrieked, reeling back, black ichor spilling from the wound. Harris staggered toward me, clutching his chest. "You can't stop it," he wheezed. "We have to try." I shot back. The thing was already rising, its twisted grin wider than ever. I grabbed Harris's arm and dragged him toward the stairs. Behind us, the creature scuttled forward, its limbs jerking and cracking with each unnatural step. We barely made it to the door when Harris's legs gave out. "Go!" he gasped, shoving me forward. "I'm not leaving you. You have to finish this," Harris choked. "End it before it's too late." The thing's shadow stretched across the floor behind us. I knew I didn't have a choice. I stumbled outside just as Harris's scream tore through the air, raw and ragged, then abruptly silent. The last thing I saw before I ran was the twisted shape of the creature dragging Harris's body back into the dark. I ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The cold night air burned in my lungs as I sprinted down the street, my heart hammering in my chest. My legs felt like lead, but the image of that twisted thing dragging Deputy Harris into the dark kept me moving. I reached my car, fumbled the keys with shaking hands, and practically fell inside. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, tires screeching as I sped away from that cursed house. I didn't stop until I was halfway across town, parked in a dimly lit gas station lot. My hands were still trembling as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to slow my breathing. "He's out now. He found a way out." Harris's words echoed in my head. The creature was loose, and I had no idea where it was or what it wanted. But something told me it wasn't finished. I grabbed my phone and called the station. Officer Darby answered. "Darby, it's me," I gasped. "You need to send backup to the house on Clearview Drive. Harris is gone. That thing killed him." "What are you talking about?" Darby asked, his tone sharp. "Harris just called in. Said he's out on patrol." I froze. What did he say exactly?" "Said he'd be checking some properties on the outskirts of town." Didn't sound too good, honestly. Voice was all scratchy. Darby paused. "Said he was heading toward your place." My stomach dropped. "He's not Harris," I said. "Get officers to my place now." I didn't wait for a reply. I threw the car into gear and sped toward home, gripping the wheel so hard my fingers went numb. When I reached my street, the sight made my blood turn to ice. Harris's cruiser was parked in my driveway, its headlights cutting sharp beams into the night. The front door to my house was wide open. I didn't bother turning off the engine. I grabbed the fire poker from the back seat, still sticky with black ichor, and rushed toward the house. The air inside felt wrong, thick and cold like stepping into a crypt. The living room lights flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the walls. "Hello," I called out. My voice barely sounded like my own. Footsteps creaked from upstairs. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I clenched the fire poker tighter and moved toward the staircase. Each step groaned under my weight. The air smelled like copper, sharp and metallic. I reached the top of the stairs, my breath fogging in the icy air. My bedroom door was ajar, a thin sliver of light stretching across the floor. I pushed the door open. There, standing in the middle of the room, was Harris, or what was left of him. His face was pale and sunken, his skin drawn tightly across his skull. Deep scratches carved jagged lines down his cheeks. His uniform was torn, black stains smeared across his chest. His eyes, glassy and empty, fixed on me. "You shouldn't have left," he rasped. His voice was twisted, gurgling like something was moving beneath his skin. "You're not Harris," I said through clenched teeth. He smiled, that awful smile, the same grin the twisted child had worn. His lips cracked, blackened gums exposed. "Let me in," the thing inside him whispered. He lunged. I swung the poker with everything I had, connected with his shoulder, but the blow barely slowed him down. His fingers, cold and bony, clawed at my face. I shoved him back and bolted down the hall. The thing that wore Harris's body followed, its footsteps pounding like thunder on the wooden floor. I reached the bathroom and slammed the door, bracing my weight against it. The door shook violently as the thing rammed it, the frame splintering with each impact. I scanned the room frantically, and then I saw it. The mirror. The woman's voice rang in my memory. "The mirror! Break the mirror!" I grabbed my toothbrush holder, the heaviest thing I could reach, and smashed the mirror with it. Glass rained down in jagged shards. The thing outside the door screamed, an unnatural, ear-splitting wail that made my skull vibrate. The pounding stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, I heard it. The faint sound of a baby crying, distant and hollow. The sound drifted up from downstairs. I knew what I had to do. I crept down the stairs, heart thudding in my ears. The crying grew louder, distorted and shrill. In the living room, something glistened on the wall. A long, jagged crack running from floor to ceiling. From within that crack, black tendrils writhed and twisted like fingers reaching from the void. And at the center, the twisted child's face. It grinned at me, black eyes wide with hunger. I grabbed the fire poker and drove it into the crack with all my strength. The wall buckled, and the child thing shrieked, its skeletal body writhing violently. Dark fluid poured from the crack like ink, spilling across the floor. The tendrils lashed out, but I struck again, this time splintering the wall open wider. The thing's face twisted in agony as its body seemed to melt into the shadow. With one final strike, the crack exploded outward, sending chunks of plaster flying. The twisted child's scream faded into a hollow wail, and then, finally, silence. The air seemed to clear almost instantly. The cold lifted. The heavy, suffocating presence vanished. I staggered back, chest heaving. Whatever that thing had been, it was gone. The police arrived minutes later, along with paramedics. They found Harris's body upstairs, his real body. Whatever had worn his face, it was something else entirely. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the memories. The twisted grin, the whispering voice, the terrible cries. I moved out of the neighborhood shortly after, unable to stay in that house a moment longer. But even now, sometimes late at night, I still hear it, faint, distant, the sound of a baby crying. And so, the story ends. A tale of shadows, whispers, and the dangers that lurk behind locked doors. Sometimes, the things we hear in the night are best left unanswered. Curiosity, no matter how innocent, can lead us to places we were never meant to go. But now you're safe. The lights are warm, the room is quiet, and the world outside is far away. Let the tension fade. Let your mind drift. The darkness beyond your window is just the night doing what it always does, wrapping the world in quiet. Take a deep breath, feel your heart slow, and let the comfort of your bed pull you into calm. Whatever waits in the shadows will stay there, for now. Sleep well, and remember, no matter what you hear, some sounds are best ignored. Good night from Mr. Phantom.